I've been driving a cab in New Orleans for over a decade, and I've had my fair share of strange experiences, but nothing compared to the night my cab seemed to take on a life of its own. It was a humid evening, and I was driving through the French Quarter, hoping to pick up some tourists. The streets were crowded with people, and the air was filled with the sounds of music and laughter. I picked up a young couple who wanted to go to a jazz club on Bourbon Street. As I was driving, I noticed something strange. The radio, which had been turned off, suddenly started playing an old jazz tune. I glanced at the couple in the back seat, but they didn't seem to notice. I reached over to turn the radio off, but the knob wouldn't budge. The music grew louder, filling the cab with a haunting melody. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I tried to ignore it and focus on the road. When we reached the club, the couple got out and thanked me. I tried to turn off the radio again, but it was stuck on that same eerie tune. I decided to drive to the nearest mechanic to see if they could fix it. As I was driving, the cab seemed to take on a mind of its own. The steering wheel jerked to the left, and the car swerved into an alley. I tried to regain control, but it was like the car was possessed. I finally managed to stop the car and get out, my heart pounding. The alley was dark and empty, and the music from the radio echoed off the walls. I popped the hood, hoping to find something wrong with the engine. But as I looked inside, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A pair of glowing red eyes stared back at me from the darkness. I stumbled back, my mind racing. Was I losing my mind? The eyes vanished and the radio went silent. I closed the hood and got back in the cab, my hands shaking. I drove to the mechanic's shop, but they couldn't find anything wrong with the radio or the car. I haven't driven that cab since. I sold it to a collector who was interested in old cars, and I never looked back. But every now and then I hear that haunting jazz tune in my dreams, and I wonder if the cab is still out there, possessed by whatever dark force had taken control that night. It was a warm summer night in Chicago, and I was driving my cab, looking for fares. Business had been slow, and I was hoping to catch a few late-night passengers before heading home. As I approached a busy intersection, I saw a man standing on the corner, waving me down. I pulled over, and he got in the back seat. He was dressed in a sharp suit, his hair neatly combed. "Where to?" I asked, glancing at him in the rearview mirror. "Take me to the old warehouse on 5th Street, he said, his voice calm and steady. I knew the place he was talking about. It had been abandoned for years, rumored to be haunted. "Are you sure? That place is pretty run down." He nodded. "Yes, I'm sure." I shrugged and started driving. The streets were quiet, and the city lights cast long shadows on the pavement. As we drove, I tried to make small talk, but he didn't seem interested. He just stared out the window, his expression unreadable. When we reached the warehouse, I pulled to a stop. The building loomed in the darkness, its windows broken and boarded up. "That'll be $15, I said. The man didn't move. He just sat there, staring at the building. "You know, they say this place is haunted," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I felt a chill run down my spine. "Yeah, I've heard the stories." He turned to look at me, his eyes dark and empty. "Do you believe in ghosts?" I didn't know what to say. "I'm not sure," I admitted. He smiled, a cold, eerie smile. "You should." Before I could respond, he got out of the cab and walked towards the warehouse. I watched him go, feeling a sense of unease. I decided to wait for a few minutes just to make sure he was okay. As I sat there, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The man walked through the door, but he didn't open it. He just passed right through it, like a ghost. I blinked, sure I was seeing things. I got out of the cab and approached the building. The door was solid, locked and chained. There was no way he could have gone through it. I backed away, my heart pounding. I got back in the cab and drove away as fast as I could. When I got back to the city, I told my dispatcher what had happened. He laughed and said I must have been seeing things. But I knew what I had seen. The man was a ghost, and he had been looking for something in that old warehouse. I never went back to that intersection, and I avoid driving past the warehouse at night. But I can't shake the feeling that he's still there, waiting for someone to give him a ride. I've been a cab driver in the rural areas of Pennsylvania for almost 15 years, and the roads can get pretty lonely at night. It was a foggy evening, and I was driving along a deserted highway, looking for one last fare before heading home. As I rounded a bend, I saw a young woman standing by the side of the road, her thumb outstretched. She was soaking wet, and her clothes were torn. I pulled over and rolled down the window. "Need a ride?" I asked. She nodded, her eyes wide with fear. "Please, I need to get to the next town." I unlocked the door, and she got in the back seat. "What happened to you?" I asked as I started driving. She looked down, her hands trembling. "I was in an accident. My car went off the road, and I've been walking for hours." I glanced at her in the rearview mirror. She looked exhausted, her face pale. "You're lucky I came along. This road doesn't get much traffic at night." She nodded, but didn't say anything else. We drove in silence for a while, the fog growing thicker. I could barely see a few feet ahead of me. Suddenly she spoke up. "Turn here," she said, pointing to a narrow dirt road. I hesitated. "Are you sure? This doesn't look like the way to town." "Please, just turn," she insisted, her voice trembling. I reluctantly turned onto the dirt road, the tires crunching on the gravel. The road was rough and winding, and I had to slow down to navigate the sharp turns. After a few minutes, she spoke again. "Stop here." I pulled over and looked around. We were in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by trees. "Are you sure this is where you want to be dropped off?" She nodded, her eyes filled with tears. "Thank you," she whispered. Before I could say anything else, she opened the door and got out. I watched as she walked into the fog, disappearing from sight. I sat there for a moment, feeling uneasy. Something about the whole situation didn't feel right. I decided to turn around and head back to the main road. As I was driving, I saw the wreckage of a car on the side of the road. It was badly damaged, and it looked like it had been there for a while. Curiosity got the better of me, and I pulled over to take a closer look. The car was empty, but I saw something that made my heart stop. On the passenger seat was a photo of the young woman I had just picked up. I stumbled back to my cab, my mind racing. How could she have been in that car? It looked like it had been abandoned for days. I drove back to town as fast as I could, my hands shaking on the wheel. I never saw the young woman again, but every time I drive that road, I think about her and wonder if she's still out there, looking for a ride home. It was a rainy evening in Los Angeles, and I was driving my usual route, hoping to make some extra cash before the night ended. I had just dropped off a passenger in a quiet residential area when I saw him, an old man standing under a streetlight, waving me down. I pulled over, and he got in the back seat, water dripping from his trench coat. He had a strange, musty smell, like old books. "Where can I take you?" I asked, glancing at him in the rearview mirror. "Take me to the old cemetery," he said in a raspy voice. I frowned. The old cemetery was on the outskirts of town, a place people usually avoided. "Are you sure? It's pretty far." He nodded, his eyes fixed on something in the distance. "Yes, I'm sure." I shrugged and started driving. The rain was coming down hard, and the roads were slick. As we drove, I tried to make small talk, but he didn't respond. He just stared out the window, his eyes unfocused. After about 20 minutes, we reached the cemetery. It was dark and overgrown, the iron gates creaking in the wind. "Here we are," I said, pulling to a stop. "That'll be $20. The old man didn't move. He just kept staring out the window. I turned around to face him, my patience wearing thin. "Hey, buddy, you need to pay up." He slowly turned his head, and I saw something that made my blood run cold. His eyes were completely black, like two empty voids. "Thank you," he whispered. Before I could react, he vanished. One moment he was there, and the next, he was gone. I sat there in shock, my mind racing. I looked around, but there was no sign of him. It was as if he had never been there at all. I sped away from the cemetery, my hands shaking on the wheel. When I got back to the city, I told my dispatcher what had happened. He didn't believe me, but I knew what I had seen. I did some research the next day and found out that the cemetery had been abandoned for years. People claimed it was haunted, and there were stories of strange figures appearing and disappearing. I haven't gone back to that cemetery since, and I avoid picking up fares in that part of town. But every time it rains, I can't help but look over my shoulder, wondering if I'll see the old man again. I've been a cab driver in New York City for over 10 years, and I've seen a lot of strange things. But nothing prepared me for the night I picked up a passenger who simply vanished. It was a cold winter night, and I was working the late shift. The streets were quieter than usual, and I was hoping to get a few more fares before calling it a night. I was parked near Central Park when I saw her, a young woman in a red coat, waving me down. I pulled over and she got in the back seat. She was shivering, her face pale. "Where to?" I asked, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. She looked up, her eyes wide and frightened. "Please just drive, anywhere," she whispered. I hesitated for a moment, but then I nodded and pulled away from the curb. As I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She kept glancing over her shoulder, as if she was being followed. "Are you okay?" I asked, trying to sound reassuring. She didn't answer, just kept looking out the window. After a few minutes, she finally spoke. "I think someone's following me. I don't know what to do." I looked in the rearview mirror again, but I didn't see any cars behind us. "I don't see anyone. Are you sure?" She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "Please just keep driving." We drove in silence for what felt like an eternity. I kept checking the mirror, but there was still no one following us. I was about to tell her we were safe when I glanced back and saw that she was gone. The back seat was empty. I slammed on the brakes and pulled over, my heart pounding. How could she have disappeared? I looked around, but there was no sign of her. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. I called the dispatcher and told them what had happened. They thought I was crazy, but they sent another cab to take over my shift. I spent the rest of the night trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had to know what happened. I went to the police station and asked if there had been any reports of a missing woman in a red coat. The officer looked at me strangely and pulled out a file. "We've had several reports like that over the years," he said, handing me a photo. My blood ran cold as I recognized the woman. She went missing about 5 years ago. Her body was never found. To this day, I don't know who or what I picked up that night. But every time I drive past Central Park, I can't help but look for the woman in the red coat, wondering if she's still out there, looking for help.